Well, thank you all for joining us today. My name is Wade Crowfoot, and I lead our California Natural Resources Agency. And myself and my colleagues today are really excited to share California's progress implementing our state climate adaptation plan, which is all about protecting people and nature from the impacts of climate change. I'm joined today by Lauren Sanchez, the Senior Climate Advisor for Governor Newsom, Sam Asafa, who leads our Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and my colleague Yana Garcia, California Environmental Protection Agency Secretary. And we're going to each share our duties today, updating on progress on this important topic. After the presentation that the four of us provide, we'll have an opportunity to answer questions that you might have. So there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen at any time during the presentation. If you have a question in your mind that you want to ask or want to share a thought, please put it into the Q&A box, and then I'll be moderating the questions once the presentation's over. We are recording the session, so know that if there's a special interest you have in anything that we said, you'll be able to circle back and review a download of the discussion or share it with others. Excitingly, before we dive into our presentation, our teams worked on a short video that summarizes what we're sharing here today. So let's go ahead and roll that video.
Wow, awesome. Thank you so much, team. Thanks, Wade, for teeing that up. What a great way to start us off today, to really ground ourselves in the state that we're all fighting to protect day in and day out. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lauren Sanchez. As Wade shared, I am the Governor's Senior Climate Advisor, and just want to thank you all for joining this afternoon. It's been a few big weeks for California's climate agenda, and I'm so excited to be here with you all today as we release a report summarizing our progress on the state's climate adaptation strategy last year. The report paints a striking picture. We see historic levels of action to reduce climate risks and major investments that the state has made that are paying off, such as those focused on increasing water resilience and protecting Californians from wildfire. And yet, reflecting on 2022, it is clear that we must move further, faster. Millions of Californians continue to feel the dangerous impacts of climate change. In 2022, we spent most of the year with all 58 of our counties under a drought emergency proclamation. We experienced a record-shattering heat wave in September, and we ended the year with destructive flooding. And as the governor likes to remind us, the hots are getting hotter, the dries are getting drier, and as evidenced by this week's April 1st snowpack measurement, an epic 236% of the average statewide snowpack, the wets are getting wetter. The world's leading climate scientists working on the recent IPCC report emphasized what we already know to be true, that our window to act to avoid the worst impacts of climate change is narrowing faster than we expected. The choices we make today matter. I am so thankful for the tireless work that our entire administration is doing in close partnership with the legislature and stakeholders around this state to protect Californians from our big 5 climate threats: flooding, drought, wildfire, extreme heat, and sea level rise. We are on the right path, for the climate crisis demands that we pick up the pace. I'm excited to be here to share our progress on climate adaptation. And before I pass the mic to Director Asefa, I wanted to highlight one more thing. Lisa, if we can pull up the logo. Today, we are unveiling a new logo to unify the climate action that we are taking across the state. The bear is an iconic symbol of California. It is strong and resilient, and we hope Californians will feel energized, hopeful, and empowered when they see this logo and know that the entire state is working across sectors to reduce climate risks. You'll soon be seeing this logo in more places as we share the work that's being done to protect our state and our communities, and the action that all Californians can take to help. Thank you all for being here today and for the work you are doing to build a more resilient California. Sam, over to you.
Thanks, Lauren. I already feel energized by that logo. As Wade mentioned, I am the director of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. Before Wade dives into the 2022 implementation report, I'm going to set the stage with key background on our approach to the climate adaptation strategy and how the 2021 update represents a critical shift in the state's efforts to build resiliency. California's early climate action focused on climate mitigation. That is to say, stopping the problem. I'm pretty sure many of you joining us today who have worked in this space know those times a couple of decades ago, focused on mitigation. Adaptation, which is about protecting people and nature from the impacts of climate change, felt like a future planning exercise. However, again, as most of you know, especially here in California, that is no longer the world we live in. As mentioned, and as you saw in the video, catastrophic wildfires, severe droughts, deadly heat waves, and rising sea levels leave no doubt the climate crisis and its devastating impacts are here. So mitigation alone is not going to cut it. In 2015, Assembly Bill 1482 required the states to issue a climate adaptation strategy every 3 years. So previous strategies were released in 2009, 2014, and 2018. These were exhaustive sector-specific inventories of actions by some 40 or so state agencies. As informative as these were, the sector-based approach had 2 key problems. First, it seemed to continue to reinforce silo thinking on an urgent issue that demanded an integrated and interconnected approach to framing the problem, seeking the solutions, and communicating out to state agencies and Californians at large. Second, the inventory documents were hundreds of pages long, listing thousands of actions, which made it really cumbersome to have access and to be able to connect the dots. The state of the climate crisis demanded a more urgent and integrated approach. This meant an approach that breaks down silo thinking, draws connections between sectors, and enables flexibility to keep pace with a rapidly changing state of the climate crisis. So the 2021 climate adaptation strategy drives on this new approach. It does this in 4 very specific ways. First, by reflecting key pillars of our specific sectoral efforts, showing how they fit together and drive us toward California's 6 climate resilience priorities, which are 1, strengthen protections for climate vulnerable communities, bolster public health and safety, build a climate resilient economy, and accelerate natural-based climate solutions, including strengthening our natural systems, make decisions based on science, and partnering and collaboration to leverage our resources. The second way that the strategy drives on this new approach is by including time-bound success metrics for all actions for the first time. And this will help drive progress and increase accountability. And the third way is by providing a central website that outlines the key pillars of the state's climate resilience efforts and easily link to the detailed plans and initiatives that underpin them, including Wildfire and Forest Resilience Action Plan, Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure, Water Resilience Portfolio, and Integrated Energy Policy Report. Finally, the fourth way is by facilitating updates on a more regular basis, making it easier to understand and report on our progress. Let me show you what this looks like in the strategy itself. A lot of what I just walked you through is built into the strategy's overview. California's 6 climate resilience priorities are here, front and center, right, as you see. If you click on any one of them, you'll see a few goals we've set to drive on that specific priority. You can select any of these goals to see key actions underway to drive progress on that specific goal. Every action includes time-bound success metrics and links to more details for those seeking to dive deeper on a particular initiative. There is more on the 2021 strategy as well. This includes underscoring our commitment to build climate resilience in partnership with California Native American tribes. It outlines key takeaways from our state's best available science on how climate change is expected to impact California in the future. It also highlights the state's commitment to supporting local and regional climate adaptation action. Now, my good friend Wade will take it from here to dive into more specifics about the 2022 implementation plan reports. Wade?
Hey, thanks, Sam. Have really appreciated the partnership between our resources agency and OPR putting together the adaptation strategy last year and then the annual report this year. And what Sam just presented is what we hope is a new approach to these strategies. Rather than creating a document that sits on a shelf or is frozen in time, we're really developing a web-based framework that can adapt year over year, given that climate change and its impacts are adapting. We've really wanted to be nimble about how we're approaching this. At the same time, over the years, we've reflected that a lot of our efforts to build resilience are siloed. So think water or wildfire or transportation or housing. But the fact is, Californians don't experience climate change in a siloed way. We have to be holistic about the adaptation that we're providing. So if you think about all of our focus on pollution reduction and ultimately carbon neutrality, we have a roadmap, and that is the Air Resources Board's scoping plan. And it sets out how we're going to reduce pollution and achieve carbon neutrality. Well, think about this adaptation strategy as our roadmap to resilience, our roadmap to adjust and weather all of these climate impacts and protect our human and natural communities here in coming decades. And so that's what this is fundamentally about. The update that we're sharing or launching today starts off with a summary of climate impacts experienced in 2022. So each year we're going to essentially provide like the year in review of impacts. And I won't belabor the point that Lauren made, but it's worth restating, which is we had another year of climate extremes. So in September, we had our longest and hottest heat wave ever experienced in the American West on record. That's the one that nearly disrupted our electricity grid. The water year that ended in October ended the longest 3-year, the driest 3-year period on record. So the driest 3-year period over the last few years. Then in January, with those atmospheric rivers, almost a dozen of them, we experienced among our wettest 3 weeks on record. So from the driest to the wettest, and then of course we've continued to get this incredible set of storms, and now this record-breaking snowpack. It's worth noting that over the last 3 years, fully 7% of our states been impacted by wildfire. And so while the wildfire season was more muted last summer, thankfully, than the previous two, obviously major impacts there. And then, of course, the extreme heat and the sea level rise impacting communities in so many ways. So this provides a snapshot of all that, and we'll continue to provide that year over year. The bulk of report summarizes where we're at across these 6 different priorities, which we call the pillars. Those are the 6 priorities that Sam provided. First and foremost, prioritizing protection of the most vulnerable climate communities. It's these 6 priorities, these 6 pillars that are really the North Stars that guide all of our efforts, whether it's on transportation or land use or housing or water. It's really, these are the animating, the shaping pillars. And so we have a set of actions established last year in the adaptation strategy that is focused on achieving each of these 6 priorities across all of those sectors. And then we're holding ourselves accountable, as Sam pointed out, for metrics or measurements around, are we achieving these actions? So for the first time, this annual report really measures our achievement. And there's good news here. Nearly 3/4 of the strategy's success metrics are well underway or ongoing or completed. For the first time last year, the 2021 strategy built in these metrics, as I mentioned, and you can find those on the climateresilience.ca.gov. And our colleague Geeta has been putting in helpful informational links into the chat as we presented. So the first link that was provided is actually to the updated report. So we learned a lot with this first attempt to set metrics in this report, including the importance of consistent timeframes. So we'll build in these learnings, these improvements into each of these annual reports. And again, that means that every year we're going to have an updated, essentially online framework that helps you understand where we believe we're at in our adaptation efforts. Our key takeaway is California is on the right path. I think we can thank ourselves across the state, including local governments, federal, tribal governments, community groups, leaders, for all of our collective efforts. We're doing more, I think, than most anywhere in the world to protect ourselves from these threats. But at the same time, because we live in this Mediterranean climate that's vulnerable to all these changes, climate change is accelerating and providing real challenges. So yes, we're on the right path, but the climate crisis demands that we move faster. And that's what we're really focused on. So I want to highlight a few compelling examples of where state agencies have made progress in each of these 6 priorities. Again, first and foremost, strengthening protections for climate vulnerable communities. This image on the left is the sum total or the result of a grant that was provided back in 2015 by the California Energy Commission to the Blue Lake Rancheria in Humboldt County. It provided $5 million to establish a microgrid that could island from the grid during disasters, designed to provide support or energy during emergencies, including power to a Red Cross center. And importantly, the microgrid provided a lifeline to not only the rancheria, but the surrounding community during recent major events, including 2 wildfires and the 2022 earthquake, when the region lost power. It operates seamlessly during these outages. And actually, I have a good friend who lives in Blue Lake, and he explains how important it is to be able to actually go over to the rancheria to charge phones and in his case, charge his car during those outages. And on the right, in 2022, the Energy Commission awarded Indian Energy a grant for $31 million to deploy a 60 megawatt hour hybrid long duration energy storage battery system at the property owned by the Viejas tribe of Kumeyaay Indians. This is one of the largest revenue transfers or grants to Native American tribe. And this is providing long duration storage, not only to the tribe, but to the grid. A great example of both building resiliency of local communities and our tribal partnerships. The next slide is another example of building these protections for the most climate vulnerable communities. A program was launched through the Health and Human Services Agency for community health workers or promotoras in the San Joaquin Valley, specifically Tulare County, to refer farm workers with climate-related health conditions to receive prioritized home weatherization and energy efficiency services that can improve housing conditions and health. So a really good example of partnering with community-based organizations to build connection to state resources for our most marginalized and vulnerable communities. Next slide really provides examples of progress in our second pillar, which is bolstering public health and safety. The two photos demonstrate the wildfire resilience work happening. The one on the left is the prescribed fire, low-level fire to reduce the risks of big catastrophic fires. And the one on the right is doing some vegetation management, quite possibly a fuel break around communities to protect communities and let firefighters take a stand. In the past year, our agencies, including CAL FIRE, have completed more than 250,000 defensible space inspections to help people that live in these high hazard areas for wildfire understand how they can protect their homes. Our CAL FIRE met its 100,000 acre goal for fuel reduction projects for the third straight year. And we saw real results of these projects. In some cases, last wildfire season, we experienced wildfires burning into these managed areas, allowing firefighters to extinguish the blaze or otherwise stopping the blaze in that area. Overall, last season, we experienced an 85% reduction in acres burned and a 78% reduction in structures destroyed. Now, a lot of this is obviously Mother Nature, and we got some well-timed rain, but we do know that the work that's happening across communities, led by communities and supported by the state, is working. Next slide is another example around public health and safety, and that's Prepare California, which is a program of California Office of Emergency Services designed to leverage federal and state funds to support the most socially vulnerable communities for future natural hazard events. And $4.5 million was provided through this Jumpstart portion of the program to enable investment in infrastructure improvements in those vulnerable communities, like strengthening levees here. So that's another good example. Third priority, next slide, is building a climate resilient economy. And these are, slide on the left here is of a group that's learning about lithium production. Lithium is a rare earth metal that's really important to our clean energy future, including car batteries. And we have an abundant resource in the southeastern part of the state, actually where I'm at today in Imperial Valley. And right now we're extracting a very high temperature brine out of the ground to create geothermal energy, which is an emission-free baseload power. And so technology is being developed as we bring that brine out to remove the lithium from that for use for this industry. It's really exciting. And we're focused with leaders down here in working with the community and tribes to, one, help everybody understand the process and to mitigate environmental impacts, which are frankly quite minimal with this technology, but also to work together to build economic prosperity and attract not only folks to help separate this lithium, but to develop the products that will power our clean energy economy and bring jobs to this region. We're really, really excited about that. So you're seeing the manifestation, like quite literally on the right side of the screen of this effort. Next slide. This example is from the Gleason Beach roadway realignment led by Caltrans. It's the first major project to make our transportation system more resilient to sea level rise. And it's along Highway 1 in Sonoma County. And it provides a long-term sustainable transportation solution to the roadway. So it's essentially moving the roadway away from the coastal erosion impacts that are driven by sea level rise. And it's an example of where our transportation colleagues are integrating climate science and sea level rise projections to modify infrastructure. It's a 3-year, $26 million project. And it's the only road connecting the communities of Bodega Bay and Jenner along Highway 1. So it's really important. You're going to see more of these projects where we're shaping and reshaping the investment of infrastructure dollars to ensure these projects are resilient. The next priority is lifting up nature-based solutions. So, and strengthening the resilience of our natural systems. Incredible set of ecosystems we have in California. We have to protect that biodiversity. We know that better protection of nature and integrating solutions that utilize nature are good, not only for the environment, but to us too. This slide indicates or symbolizes our multi-benefit land repurposing program, which our Department of Conservation runs to help regions transition irrigated lands to meet groundwater sustainability goals, and creates a path where essentially, farmland is not going to be irrigated anymore for other constructive uses, whether that's energy generation or habitat or recreation, working with communities to plan for a sustainable future. Now, in 2022, Department of Conservation awarded $42 million in projects. And just this January, we awarded our first grant to a tribe, $1.7 million to the Dry Creek Rancheria Band of Pomo Indians to support groundwater recharge project planning and development. Really exciting. The next slide is another example of nature-based solutions, and that is urban forestry and greening. In 2022, CAL FIRE invested over $30 million for 42 specific projects, greening our most vulnerable communities to extreme heat. It's a big deal with multiple benefits, including the fact we'll keep our kids and our seniors, our vulnerable residents, cooler during these more intensifying heat waves. We also launched a new program, thanks to the legislature and the governor's investment of $150 million to green schoolyards. And I'm really excited that some of that money is actually rolling out this month. We've got school systems across the state really eager to make their schoolyards cooler and safer and greener. And so this is another way that everyone is manifesting resilience. The second to last priority is making decisions based on the best available climate science, where California has always led. We are now to our 5th climate change assessment. This is the 5th round of funding that we're providing to scientists to help us understand how climate change is impacting California. And it's going to deliver quality controlled, open access data and climate projections, which we think is going to be really helpful. On the left side of the slide is the landing page of the so-called CalAdapt analytics engine, which is all about democratizing, making data more accessible from the 5th climate assessment so that others can actually utilize that data on projects. And then as part of the 5th climate assessment, we're using the next generation of climate research to inform all of the work that we're talking about. So under Sam and OPR's leadership, we've selected specific topics, or are selecting specific topics for this research investment that are directly informing the management that our governments, not only state, federal, tribal, local, need to do here in coming years with climate change. We're also standing up a tribal research program that works as part of that 5th climate assessment. We know we have to integrate traditional ecological knowledge that tribes have been using for thousands of years. And we want to do that respectfully in partnership with the tribes. So that takes me to the next slide, which is all about partnering with tribes and providing opportunities for stewardship for tribes. And so this Tribal Marine Steward Network is the first of its kind in the US. and it's essentially enabling 5 tribes to exercise stewardship and leadership of our marine resources across California's coast. We think it's a powerful model that we can emulate in different areas. Next slide. And the last is just, it's a little bit general, but it's important to note because the work that gets done on resilience is not a state government program. It's the work of all of us, including the several hundred that have joined us today. And so it's all about finding those partnerships. These 2 slides are symbolizing climate smart agriculture. So leveraging statewide climate smart incentive programs to improve irrigation practices on many farms, including the ones in these photos. Our most recent estimates suggest that farms are saving 47 billion gallons of water this year as a result of irrigation incentive programs like this. So recognizing that we need to work together, it's programs like this that are partnering. And then the last slide is our slides taken from our Community Economic Resilience Fund program, or SERF, that Sam and other agency secretaries helped to lead. All about working with regions, with communities on a bottom-up, equitable and sustainable economic plan across our diverse regions. So we foster long-term economic resilience and transition to the carbon neutral economy and protect our communities from climate change. And it's really focused on a so-called high road approach to economic development, where this is all about the creation of good paying jobs and equitably accessed prosperity to those jobs. So in a moment, I'm gonna turn it over to my colleague Jana, but I'll just tell you that the next steps of this report that I've just summarized, we're required by statute to deliver an update on the strategy by 2024. And so we're kicking off an update to that 3-year strategy next January. And there'll be a ton of opportunity for public input. And then we're building lessons learned on related to progress reporting. So we're gonna be working on really making sure we're showing how we're doubling down on prioritizing California's most vulnerable communities, expanding our public engagement, incorporating new content, and then really learning from you all what's working, what information gaps that you have. So I'm now going to turn it over to Jana Garcia, who's our Cal EPA secretary, and I'll say, a lot of the work that we're doing on equity and vulnerable communities, Cal EPA has really been working on for well over a decade. And so Jana, huge thanks. Our agency learns every day from the work that you all do at Cal EPA in terms of lifting up equity and environmental justice.
Thanks, Wade, and thanks, folks. Really appreciate being able to be here with so many of you who are joining us, and of course, my colleagues across the administration. As you all know, California is well known for our ambition in environmental protection and in climate action. And to Wade's point on the work that we've been doing around equity and environmental justice and prioritizing benefits to disadvantaged and vulnerable and disproportionately burdened communities, we know we still have a lot to do. And we know that the weather whiplash we've experienced over the past few months on the back end, on the tail end of drought and wildfire, as well as health impacts from the COVID-19 pandemic and other health challenges that too many communities have faced, show us that it's not enough to just reduce pollution. We get a long way by reducing pollution, but we have to invest in our resilience capacity to weather the storms, to weather the extreme events that are becoming all too common. So I want to talk a little bit about generally some of the work that we're doing on emergency response and recovery as something more forward-looking, and then also some of the investments we've made in drought and water resilience, wildfire data, extreme heat, and then some of the vulnerabilities, particularly for children and pregnant women that we're tracking within Cal EPA. So one of the priorities that we have across the administration, of course, in facing the recent storms and and in thinking about how we're going to manage the unprecedented snowpack and impacts therefrom, is that we really need effective community partnerships with so many of you. That is so critical, as Secretary Crowfoot was mentioning, to our ability to deliver resilience capacity to communities on the ground. We need to be able to deploy emergency response and recovery resources in a way that is trusted by the communities that are most impacted by the extreme weather events that we're facing. That's something that we're working on. That has been a challenge, I think, for many of us, and I know is a challenge for many of you on the ground. And we know that decades of poor land use decisions and underinvestment have placed certain communities at the front lines more than others. So we're very focused on making sure that our adaptation efforts, our response efforts are focused on those communities and their resiliency. I want to talk a little bit about some of the water work that we've done within the Environmental Protection Agency, but also across the administration. So as part of leveraging the more than $8.6 billion committed by Governor Newsom and the legislature in the last two budget cycles, the State Water Board has provided $50 million in emergency assistance to almost 10,000 households and 150 water systems confronted with water outages due to drought, contamination, and failing infrastructure. This is really critical to building resiliency capacity on the ground. And $3.3 billion was actually provided to water systems in the last fiscal year, and the board just recently approved another $2.7 billion in financial assistance this year to help communities pay for critical drinking water and wastewater infrastructure, storage projects, and a priority given to disadvantaged communities to serve their water resiliency needs. And I want to note that the Safer Advisory Committee, a committee that was established a few years ago, is really critical to being able to prioritize where these investments go. We appreciate the service of so many community members on that committee and others. We cannot do the work to prioritize exactly where these dollars would be best spent without the contributions from so many of you. So I want to thank you all for that. The Water Board has also dedicated $27 million of grant funding to the Coachella Valley Water District, critical to increasing the use of non-potable water, recycled wastewater for irrigation, and to reduce groundwater overdraft. Although we're seeing so much water now at the surface water level, we still have groundwater depletion that we need to address. So all of these critical investments ensure Californians have a sustainable water future, a future where we continue to provide relief to those communities still experiencing drought conditions despite the recent rainfall and despite the snowpack, and where we invest in our infrastructure to improve drought resilience over time, especially in disadvantaged and vulnerable communities. And we simultaneously are able to diversify supplies as we face aridification, which is challenging to see at this point when we have such wet weather, but we know that the dries will continue to get drier. And this includes our ability to capture stormwater in our urban communities and recharge our groundwater aquifers during large rain events. Now, of course, we know that drought and flooding are only some of the climate-fueled extremes that we're facing. And as we confront increasingly intense wildfire seasons, we're also preparing for the challenges that those present. Within Cal EPA, that includes household hazardous waste removal and debris removal, but it's also very important for us to be able to, across the administration, identify where wildfire vulnerability exists. And many of you may be aware that Cal EPA's Office of Environmental Health Hazards Assessment has been working with many state and local agencies, as well as others community-based organizations, to develop a wildfire resiliency tool. This is a tool that will design a way for us to focus on efforts specifically on vulnerable populations in high wildfire hazard areas when we're implementing climate change funding, mitigation, and educational programs. I've also tasked OEHA in response to AB 2238 to develop an extreme heat ranking system. This is a system that will be accessible through a mobile application and a web page to notify Californians that a heat event is occurring and to identify local resources that they can access to protect themselves, such as the nearest cooling center. This will be extremely important to help some of our vulnerable, particularly outdoor workers, in facing the impacts of extreme heat. Finally, I want to point out that OEHA, the Office of Environmental Health Hazards Assessment, has released a children's environmental health report and is conducting a series of workshops on the effect of heat on children and pregnant mothers. This is particularly important when we think about those who are most vulnerable to heat impacts and a critical part of our adaptation strategy moving forward. These workshops will focus on the physiological and epidemiological impacts of heat health effects and will lead to discussions of strategies for combating climate and the resulting health impacts and a consideration of heat health warning systems for children and pregnant people. I want to conclude by recognizing that it's particularly fitting we're talking about California's adaptation strategy as we kick off Earth Month. Happy Earth Month to all of you. I believe this is a time to double down on our commitments to adapt to a changing climate and act with renewed urgency to improve our resilience capacity, particularly in communities that are already facing the brunt of the climate crisis. Thank you so much for your partnership, and I'll turn it back over to you, Secretary Crowfoot.
Hey, thank you so much. And I know we're going to ask you to stay on screen if you would. Yana and Sam and Lauren, if she's available to come back on screen. We've got a number of good questions coming in that we're going to answer here in the next 15 minutes. And I will do my best to throw those out there, and let's just keep the answers relatively short so we can answer as many questions as possible. The first one is a big one. And John asks a question, and he compliments the video and says that it demonstrated just how severe this wildfire crisis is. But he explains that, you know, we've got a lot underway that's helpful, but we need sustained funding over time to really get this catastrophic wildfire crisis under control. And I think you could expand that question across, you know, different threats. So how do we answer this question around future funding and the consistency and durability of funding for the ongoing work we have to do in resilience? And maybe, Lauren, because you're in the governor's office, I'll turn that tough question over to you.
Thanks, Secretary Crowfoot, and thank you, John, for the tremendous question. I would say, to take a step back, you know, the state had been very fortunate to have a number of budget surplus years, and we were really lucky to be working with the legislature under the direction of Governor Newsom to make sure that our climate investments were in fact meeting the crisis in terms of the scale and the urgency that it requires. So looking back 2 years, we started with a big climate package that we then increased quite a bit last year as well. That includes tens of billions of dollars in climate investments. A lot of that funding is earmarked for all of the activities that we've talked about today and the specific projects that Secretary Crowfoot showed the photos of that are kind of already impacting and benefiting communities across the state. We now, unfortunately, have a different fiscal situation, as the governor talked about in his Jan 10 budget presser. So we are working with the legislature on ongoing funding issues related to climate broadly. I will point to two things we're really excited about in the state. The first is the $369 billion that the federal government has earmarked for climate investments through the Inflation Reduction Act and the IIJA. I know each of my colleagues that are on the screen with me now are making sure that we are as competitive as possible for all of the federal funding coming into the state. And then secondly, the governor is excited to be working with stakeholders across the state and the legislature in exploring a climate bond. You know, we're very interested in thoughts, opinions, and perspectives from all of you on that going forward. I will just point out, when I first came to the state government, we were funding all of these programs with tens of millions of dollars from our greenhouse gas reduction fund. So we've really been incredibly fortunate to be spending so much money. We've gotten a lot of money out the door in the last 2 years, and we're excited, as Secretary Garcia emphasized, to partner with you all on how to spend those dollars most effectively so that they benefit communities and protect communities, as we know we need to. Secretary Crowfoot, I don't know if you want to specifically speak to the wildfire funding in more detail.
Well, I would just say that we have an incredible amount of funding thanks to the last couple of years and the governor and the legislature, almost $3 billion to do this proactive upfront work in partnership with communities. And that's really important, but we need this ongoing pipeline of funding. So we, you know, will be part of the conversation on this bond that you referenced, which is an exciting opportunity, but then also working to try to identify ways that we can stand up ecologically sustainable industry to be able to actually utilize this stuff that's, you know, coming out of the forest right now, where we're doing, you know, forest management work. In some cases, we're essentially leaving this vegetation in the forest, which is, you know, not improving the wildfire risk, or not as much as we could. So there's a lot of things that we were going to do to build a more durable funding stream for a wildfire resilience, but it's what we're absolutely committed to. I want to ask a question of Secretary Garcia, but Sam, or Director Afsefa, you could jump in. We're getting some questions around, some level of skepticism around working with governmental agencies and how do we ensure that the work that we're doing with vulnerable communities is truly in partnership with those communities and doesn't feel imposed on by Sacramento, but is sort of co-created. So maybe if each of you wanted to provide what you think is the best answer to that, or maybe an example of where it's working.
I'm happy to take that first, then turn it over to you, Director Afsefa, if that works. Well, a couple of things, and thanks for the question here. One is, I think it's really important for government to and those of us who serve in government and public service to recognize the history that has taken place, not just at the national level and globally, but here in California. Statewide, regionally, and locally, with so many communities, largely communities of color, and low-income communities across our state. So taking the onus and the responsibility to remedy and alleviate inequities where they have been allowed to persist, where in too many instances, in fact, government action or inaction for many decades has allowed that to persist, and really being able to hone in on what it will take to alleviate those inequities and come to the table with community-based organizations with some proposals of what that could look like, and to get meaningful input on those proposals. I also think it's important to create spaces for non-transactional relationships with folks, to be able to really take ongoing input. And we've seen a couple of examples of that with data and analyses. For example, our pollution and prejudice mapping tools that we've developed over time, our CalEnviroscreen process, while challenging, I think, for many in terms of the use of CalEnviroscreen for cap and trade funds, for the greenhouse gas reduction funds. That has been a challenging discussion, but we've also engaged in really rich discussions around what it means to focus on disproportionately burdened communities, what it means to focus on vulnerable communities, and how we can play that out in a variety of contexts.
Thanks. To add to that, I think, part of why I came here a year and a half ago is because more than any other place, I think California is leading in this space. The idea that, or what we learned over the last few years, and unfortunately through COVID, is one, we know who are the most impacted. It's right in front of our face, in people of color, people who have less resources previously. And second, and more importantly, this idea that top-down approach will solve problems is something that has been debunked. And I think California, more than any other state, has recognized that. And I'll give you a few examples. Soon after I came, the governor and his administration started thinking about a structure that responded well around census and the COVID response. This structure had to do with a group of people from Department of Health and other places who came together in that rapid response, but also engage in the census with hundreds of community-based organizations. The lessons learned from that is the governor wanted to figure out how to institutionalize that, and then created a new office within Office of Planning and Research that we stood up 8 months ago, called Office of Community Partnership and Strategic Communications. This is the first time any state has actually institutionalized an organization and an office whose specific job is to work with local, trusted, community-based organizations, so that they chart their path and that they are the messengers on the most pressing issues. So within my office, this office is building up. We just put out an RFP to actually pay and secure close to 250 community-based organizations statewide, so that we hear from them in terms of the most pressing issues, whether it's around land use, extreme heat, economic development, any of the pressing issues. That's kind of one example. Wade mentioned the Community Economic Resiliency Fund. That is specifically created to be a bottoms-up approach to charting an economic future for California. And not to mention a couple of, my office will be standing up a new structure now, the Racial Equity Commission. Again, the first of its kind in any state, commission that's going to advise the state how to break down institutional barriers and institutional racism as it relates to our investments. So more to list, but there are more questions to go through. Wade?
Yeah, I know we're all really passionate about the true partnerships. Two questions that I'll turn into suggestions. One participant asks if there is a way to find out what an individual person should be doing or can be doing to combat climate change and build resilience. And then the other person, Alice, asks, is there a central database where there's information on all of these different opportunities for communities? I ask them as questions, but I also put them as suggestions because I think we can do a better job, providing information on both. Sam.
Well, in the second question, we have a very extensive database called Adaptation Clearinghouse that OPR manages. It's a great resource. I would highly encourage you, and I'll put the link down. That's a good place to go specific to adaptation and climate issues.
And then Lauren, I would add that you have something maybe cooking up later this month.
Yeah, I was just going to, I don't know if my comms team was watching, will be upset with me for teeing this up, but two great questions, a big focus of the state right now. We are hoping to launch later this month, celebrating Earth Month, as Secretary Garcia said, additional ways that make it easier for Californians to take action on climate change, including access, really the historic funding that we've put towards household rebates and community incentives, whether it's making sure that low-income Californians can get into a clean car, or you can replace your grass with drought-resilient turf. So stay tuned, and you'll be hearing more from this entire team on that this month.
That's great. And I would just say, we have almost 400 people in this discussion, and one idea coming out of those last two questions would be maybe a follow-up webinar, which is a little bit of a deeper dive on resources that are available to communities and individuals that are really focused on resilience. So I think that's a really good one. So a lot of these questions are really specific on a topic. So just in respect to everybody, we're not going to be able to tick through those. But one just provocative question I want to ask you here as we near the top of the hour is, somebody's asking, what is the most difficult aspect or area of resilience, or one that's been particularly challenging? I think it's an opportunity to have an honest conversation that, as Secretary Garcia said, we still have a lot of work to do. But does anything come to mind as particularly challenging?
I can take the first stab, and then interested in the opinions of my colleagues here. But I would say that the number one biggest challenge that I think all of you can likely relate to is just the repeated nature of everything that we're responding to. I would say the cumulative effect of so many impacts from multiple issues that are affecting often the same communities, whether that's, as we talked about, the remnants of the COVID-19 pandemic, which many of us are still experiencing, the economic impacts thereof, the parallel nature of wildfire, drought, and extreme weather events. It's challenging to be able to prepare for all of it at once. And that's a challenge that we are faced with at the state level. It's a challenge that, frankly, many of our state colleagues are also feeling at the state level, that our federal colleagues are responding to as well. As we've seen, there have been tornadoes and hurricanes affecting many folks across the nation. And so it's something that, so many of you live with day in and day out. And from a policy implementation standpoint is also challenging to keep our arms around at all times.
Thank you for that. Lauren or Sam?
I'll point to one, which is, I think, as progressive as we are as a state, we also do this work with humility, and that the challenges are huge, but it's also true that state governments are really slow to respond. I'd say that being within the state government, and a state government that is far advanced than any other, but still catching up with the fast changing challenges and changing our institutions to actually be adaptive or resilient and responsive is one of the challenges. We're working on that, but that is one of the challenges that I see, changing institutions to be ready for the challenges that we have before us. That's
totally.
one big challenge that I see.
Absolutely. Lauren?
I would say our biggest challenge, which the three of you and your teams have made tremendous progress on, is just the integration and the holistic approach that is really needed to tackle this crisis. Climate change isn't an environmental issue or a planning issue or natural resources issue. It's also a housing and a transportation issue, a health issue, and an economic issue in this state. And so what I love about this work that we've been able to highlight today is that you're breaking down silos and making sure that all of the government agencies who need to be at the table finally are. And as we think about even looking at the climate budget, there are investments in all three of your agencies, but we also invested climate funding in across the state government to make sure that each agency can do its part in tackling the crisis and in protecting communities. I'm most passionate, however, about extreme heat. I feel like California has been on the front page of the global news on wildfire and drought over the last few years, tragically. But it feels like extreme heat, given its disproportionate impacts on low-income communities, communities of color, outdoor workers, is something I'm really excited to get ahead of looking into this summer and what we can expect to be a hot fall. What about you, Wade? Which one are you?
Wow.
What's
Well,
the biggest challenge?
I'll end it by saying that, climate change continues to surprise. I mean, we have been meeting weekly on drought and the drought emergency for well over 2 years, and we were staring down the barrel of a fourth, dry year, record-breaking drought. And instead, we had a record-breaking and tragically impactful flood. So I think this is, the mantra of expect the unexpected has to, be foremost to our thoughts as we do all this resilience work. I think thanks to many who joined here and the community leaders and groups, we're making progress building resilience, but we have to do it with great urgency and with more integration than ever, just given the evolving threat of climate change. And that's really partnership. So let me end with this. If you go up to the first link that our colleague Gita provided, it's to the adaptation strategy that has this updated report on it today. If you can spend some time with that website, let us know how we're doing, where you think there are gaps. As we mentioned, we are now beginning the update for our strategy in January. So while we take all of these protective actions and build our resilience, we're continuing to adaptively manage. So we'll want more feedback from you all in terms of how this is working. Is this transparent enough, clear enough, specific enough? And I think one key takeaway is to follow up and build understanding of what resources are available to you all as individuals and as communities to really take leadership in your own communities. Secretary Garcia, Director of SEFA, Senior Advisor Sanchez, otherwise known as Yana, Sam, and Lauren. Thank you so much for all of the partnership. Thanks to all of you, hundreds who have joined here today, and we will continue to make shared progress together. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
Thanks all.
Thanks, Wade.
Bye-bye.
Everybody.